want to give a special nod to Iris Howard, who turned 80 this week. Jen and I stopped by her birthday celebration yesterday, and we went over there and they had these little cards to write down memories you have. And we went up there, we wrote down a memory, and all of a sudden this kid kind of comes walking up to us, asks us what we're doing, maybe 9 years old-ish, something like that. And we said, oh, well, we're writing a memory down for Miss Iris. He said, why? Well, so we celebrate her birthday. And then he looks at me and says, and why does your hair look so weird? I don't know, but thanks for asking. That was nice of you.
Hey, Tyler.
Yes.
Mr. Max Grogan turned 90 too this weekend.
Max Grogan turned 90? Wow. Iris wants to point out that she's not 80 until Tuesday. Okay. But let's not put too fine a point on it. Okay, all right. So a while back there were these commercials. And I don't know if you remember, but there was a character called Captain Obvious. And of course, people have been called Captain Obvious for years and years, but this character embodied that. And as he would walk around, he would say things that were so painfully obvious that there was really no need to say them. It was almost ridiculous, almost redundant, almost silly. If Captain Obvious had attended our service today, he might look out and say, the music we played this morning was very musical. Doesn't mean very much. Or he might look in our pews and say, the Holy Bible is long and holy. He might have looked at our youth minister who was on stage playing the music today and said, the youth minister is very bold. It's obvious. Or he might have looked and said, the senior minister appears to be a senior in high school. The painfully obvious. And as we're talking about painfully obvious observations, I'm thinking of Paul we're continuing in the book of Galatians in chapter 5 and verse 1. Paul says what is to me one of the most painfully obvious verses in the Bible. It makes me wonder why he bothered to say it. And we are continuing this series in Galatians talking about kind of legalism and the mistakes that the church there was making. But in chapter 5 and verse 1, we've got it up there, Paul says this, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Then he goes on and says, and stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. So, look at that statement. It is for freedom that you have been set free. Now, that's a nice little verse to memorize. You've probably heard it before, but what does that mean? It is for freedom that you've been set free. Could you possibly be set free for any other reason? Why does Paul say this? It's almost Captain Obvious. It's duh. He set you free for the purpose of being free. Now, the context of this is, of course, that the Galatian church, these Christians from this region of Galatia, had some other people come by and introduce to them the importance of Old Testament laws, all 600 and some of them in the Bible, and convince them that they would have to follow all of those laws in order to be saved and be the people that God wanted them to be. And so they found themselves wrapped up in special days and holidays and sacrifices and ceremonial cleansings and all of those things. When Paul wants them to know that they've been set free from that by Christ. And he feels the need to argue in favor of their freedom. from Old Testament laws. They're basically stuck in what we would call legalism, but really that legalism that came directly from the Old Testament law. And so if you were to back up into chapter 4 a little bit and look at how Paul is forming his argument, he's actually going to use an illustration, just like a preacher would use an illustration. He draws on another story and then explains how that relates to them. And he goes back to the story of Hagar and Sarah. Do you recall those names? Earlier in the book, he had referenced Abraham and how God had given him a promise long before the law ever existed. But here he's talking about Abraham's wife and his concubine. If you recall, part of the promise to Abraham was that he would have a son. His name literally means father of a multitude. And yet he had no children. And so Abraham takes it in his own hands to make sure he fathers a child, and he does it not through his wife, but through his concubine, Hagar. Which, of course, anytime you sort of push along God's plan ahead of schedule, creates conflict in the end, and you have the concubine and her son, Ishmael, and then later his wife, Sarah, has a son named Isaac, who is the child of promise. But here is the issue. Now you have Hagar and her son, and Sarah and hers. One given by Abraham's flesh is jumping ahead, the other given by the promise of God. And there's a problem at that point. And Abraham takes that story and says that there are those in this world who are part of one covenant that has to do with slavery and laws and the flesh and never quite succeeds. And then the other one based on a promise of God. And so you can look at his sort of summary of that if you were to go to chapter 4, verse 21, and he says it this way. Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as the result of a divine promise. And these things are being taken figuratively. The women, he says, represent two covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. Now Hagar stands, and he gets into a rather in-depth illustration here. Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia. It corresponds to the present-day city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. And then skipping down to the final statement. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. It's an illustration, just as I would give an illustration. He goes back to the story and says one is kind of like the old covenant, one kind of like the new covenant. One actually leads you into slavery and is rejected by God and is bothered by our tendency toward the flesh. But the other one is freedom, so don't be a slave anymore. So, you have Paul arguing in favor of all these things. And this week I'm thinking about how to discuss slavery to laws and rules in a way that sort of traps us from God versus the freedom in Christ that comes. And for the last few weeks we've been talking in terms of legalism and how legalism is one of those things that has hurt the church over centuries, really. Calling to mind those things that are not biblical issues and not salvation issues and not important, and using them to drive people away from God. But today, I felt led to change that image slightly, because legalism doesn't feel like slavery to anything. It's just a tendency that we have. But this week, as I was thinking and praying and talking, I thought of another parallel to the Old Testament law. And it's what we sometimes refer to as being a perfectionist. Have any of you ever been called a perfectionist? Couple. Some get everything in their life right. And they believe they have control of it. And if anything in their life goes wrong, it will drive them crazy. If anything in their life is not exactly perfect, it is something that they cannot handle. And I thought of this as being the sort of thing that can enslave people. Because in our life, we're not so much slaves to doing the Old Testament sacrifices or to ritual cleansings or all of these sorts of Old Testament things we can't relate to that the Galatian church had. But we do become slaves to trying to get everything in our life perfect. Sometimes our society and our school system, they push us to get everything right or fall behind. And in so doing, we can become enslaved to our need to be right in all of it. And I say that because I know people and because I myself can relate to some of those tendencies. I have felt that kind of slavery. And so just to give you some examples of my past in this area, let's just say in high school, I had an actual conversation with my gym teacher about how the standard good grade that he gave out to students who participated, which was a 95, was going to hurt my GPA and hurt my chances for valedictorian. That was a real conversation I actually had. I grew up going to wrestling tournaments every weekend, and so for a great deal of my childhood and my adolescence, gaining weight throughout a year was not an option. And that was really difficult because wrestling season, if you know when the season is, it runs basically through Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, and Valentine's Day. Talk about missing out on all the good meals. And maybe too often I still think in terms of those sorts of ways about it's not an option. In high school, when I would write something personal, not for a class, just something personal, I often would end up throwing it away because I thought it was bad. It wasn't perfect yet. To this day, if I'm working on a sermon, I can guarantee you no one gets to look at my sermon notes until it's been perfected. Not even my wife. I'm very proud about that. Because I want it to be just right. In my life growing up, I gave up social life and dating and other elements for education. I battled silly little nervous twitches like blinking too much or apologizing constantly, and I'm sorry for that, but it's true. I had times when I tapped my head to keep out bad thoughts so I didn't sin against God. Sometimes today, I can even ruminate on the things about myself I don't like, or the things which I feel like I'm lacking. I once made an actual list of all the things about myself that I needed to work on. I would pray to God to forgive me for my dreams at night when I was asleep because I was afraid I might sin in them. I was voted most likely to succeed by my high school class, and then I decided to become a preacher just to prove them wrong. Earlier this very year, I sat in an arena watching the Oklahoma City Thunder play the San Antonio Spurs. I saw the upcoming MVP, Russell Westbrook, score a triple-double on his way to averaging a triple-double for the entire year, which is the first time since the 60s anyone has done that. And I spent the second half of that game texting back to people about prayer requests and family emergencies because I didn't want to be a bad minister. I spent years of my life not sleeping much at night because my mind just never shut off. And one day I woke up and asked myself, is that freedom? It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. And all of a sudden, it doesn't sound so obvious anymore. Some people have been set free by Christ in order to become as perfect as they can today. They enslave themselves to anxiety and fear and worry and guilt and all of those things that are the opposite of the gospel of Christ. Perfectionism, if there is such a thing, is a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because you find yourselves trying to accomplish something, and maybe even succeeding in a way, but it can take away your freedom and your joy, and that is exactly what I think following the Old Testament law did to the Apostle Paul and could do to the Galatians. And that's why Paul took it so seriously. That's why they couldn't go back to the law. Now, I don't know you, and I don't know your story, and I don't know the things that you struggle with. Maybe some of you are not perfectionists. Maybe some of you need to work a little harder at things. I do too sometimes, okay? Maybe some of you are perfectionists, and you have lost your joy because you spend so much time on things that aren't really at the core of your life or at the core of Christ. If you can relate to the way that I have been and struggled and tried to move on and heal from, then I want to just tell you this. Christ did not set you free so that you could read through the bulletin each week and correct all of the uses of your Y-O-U-R and your Y-O-U''re. Christ did not set you free so that all of the pillows in your house would match the drapes on your windows in their respective rooms. Christ did not set you free so that you could eat no more than 1,500 calories a day on kale chips and rice cakes. Christ did not set you free so that you could volunteer more than your neighbor just so you could show them what a good person you are. Christ did not set you free so that your children would be perfectly behaved in church and never get their dresses dirty. Christ set you free so you could be free. So take a minute and just take a breath. It is for freedom that you have been set free. And it's a good reminder. We can say, oh, Captain Obvious, duh. Christ would set us free for freedom. I mean, it seems almost redundant, but we forget it. And we live as if it does not exist. And so here in the book of Galatians, thinking in terms of this perfectionism, I'm looking for some of the suggestions that Paul gives as ways of dealing with this. And by the way, I want you to know that even though I'm a healing perfectionist, I have come a long way, I promise you. I have great joy in life. I just wanted you to know of that past, because I've been there, and I would guess that some people have been there as well. One of the things that I think that Paul points out to those of us struggling with the law rather than the grace of Christ comes from a little bit further back in chapter 4, verses 8 through 11. And I want you to see the way that Paul references the importance of knowing God and being known by God as a contrast to the law. And so he says here in chapter 4, verse 8 and following, he says, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. But now that you know God, or rather, are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. Before, when you did not know God, but now that you do know God, or rather are being known by God." You see, when we come to that situation where it becomes for us all about the law, what we have to do is step back and run to a greater relationship with God. We have to seek to know God more, and more than that, to allow God to know us. Now, of course, God already knows you, but the true relationship is one where you talk to God, which you pray to God, you read God's Word, you listen to the songs that bring you to the foot of the cross, you write in notebooks and journals, and you do what you must do to make sure that God knows you at your deepest core, and that you know Him just a bit more. And when you can run away from this tendency to perfectionism, which inherently means that you can control it and be in charge and perfect it, and instead run to a relationship with God where He knows you and you know Him, then all of a sudden those efforts and those energy and all that stuff exhausting you by the way of trying to be perfect is now given to a relationship with God, and you become perfected. And the entire emphasis switches, and it becomes about the love of God and God's love for you. There are times in my life when I have wanted so much to change a certain behavior or a sin or something I didn't like. And I don't know about you, but usually my method for stopping doing that sinning is this. I look at myself in the mirror and I say, Tyler, stop it. Do better. And do you know how often that works? Almost never. Do you do that? Do you tell yourself, no, you've got to do better. Stop it. Do better. But unfortunately, that doesn't really tend to change me. Does it change you? Do you find yourself struggling with that same thing a little later on, a little after that? And why is that? Because that energy you're putting forth in doing better and being better isn't really effective in changing us. That's the very problem Paul has with the Old Testament law. It doesn't actually save you. It doesn't actually fix you. It's just like telling people to do better and be better. But instead, that energy that we put forth toward doing better and being better, if that energy can be redirected to pursuing God in a relationship, then what's amazing is that the frustrations tend to subside, because our goal is not that thing directly in front of us that we can't knock down, but God Himself. And in so doing, we find ourselves moving around all those obstacles and changing, because being in the very presence of God changes us. And that relationship comes, and then so does the change. And so if you find yourself frustrated with something that you're trying to change, and you keep telling yourself to do better, I think that your desires are right, but simply step aside and pursue God in a relationship. And just see if that small change of goal ultimately solves your problem. And the other thing that I think Paul suggests is to keep it simple. The Bible itself, the laws, and not just the laws that are actually in the Bible, but the societal rules and laws we put upon ourselves are inherently complicated. But the gospel is strangely simple. So in chapter 5, verse 6, Paul breaks it down to such a core that it almost amazes me. He says this: "For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts, is faith expressing itself through love." The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And if I understand that correctly, then the way that the pillows sit on the couch doesn't fall under that. And the grades I get on my report card don't necessarily fall under that. And all of the things I beat myself up about and run myself to the ground and exhaust myself over rarely have anything to do with that. The perfectionist is exhausted by all the wrong things. He works hard, but he works hard at the things that don't matter. But the Christian works hard at the things that matter the most. And he realizes, and he looks through his life, and he says, is my faith in God expressing itself through love to people? Am I changing lives? Am I listening? Am I helping? Am I serving? When I become exhausted, is it because I put a full day into showing love to my family or my neighborhood or my community? Or is it because I'm trying to please and satisfy the expectations of people around me that aren't based on the Word of God? Which is it? And so not only do we run to a relationship with God, but we keep it simpler in our life. And yes, there are rules in the Bible that we must follow, but we'll find ourselves more successful if we pursue it in keeping with our relationship with God. And if we can simplify it and stop being filled with all the complicated rules of society and all the ways we ought to do things. Because you know, you can dress a little nicer, but not too nice, because you'll turn people off. And you need to go to bed at a certain time, but if you go to bed too early, why then, you're not any fun. But if you go to bed too late, why you won't be good at your job. And if you make too much money, people will be mad at you. And if you don't make enough, they'll look down on you. And so on and so forth. Life full of its complicated rules to follow. Simplify it. It's about faith expressing itself through love. Have you done that? Are you doing that? Throw off those chains of perfectionism, of the Old Testament law, the societal laws, and actually truly find freedom in Christ. Not to do what we want, but to pursue a relationship that gives rest to our soul. Ultimately allowing us to be better people, formed in the image of God. It may seem Captain Obvious to say that Christ set you free for the purpose of being free. It seems unnecessary to me to even say that. But it is too easy to pursue perfection and waste a life. If you want to know if you are free, then jump forward to chapter 6 and look at the fruits of the Spirit. Because the free life is lived in the Spirit. And it produces the fruits of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and gentleness, and self-control. And yes, that means following some rules. But if you look at your life and say, what spirit do I have? What fruits am I producing? And you don't see love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. If what you see is fear and anxiety and sleeplessness and worry and stress and exhaustion, then you're not living in the spirit and freedom of God. You're living in a spirit of fear, and you are a slave to perfectionism or something else. So instead, run back to a relationship with God and keep it simple, and let the love of Christ truly set you free. I do feel the need to repeat one caveat. It is easy to misunderstand the freedom of Christ. On one hand, we get that we aren't bound to the sacrifice of the Old Testament. And we get that there is forgiveness when we mess up. But there are those who would want to, and will certainly argue could, take advantage of the freedom of Christ, right? Oh, well, I'm not bound to any rules. Let me just say that if that is an actual perspective that you have, you've already missed the mark of living in the spirit and life of God. Because Christ hasn't forgiven us so that we can do whatever we want during the week, and then come to Sunday and get forgiveness. That's actually not freedom either. You know how many people are enslaved to their need for certain sins? That's not freedom, okay? Plus it's full of guilt and shame, and you mess your life up, and you get trapped in places. That's not freedom, okay? I promise you. If you really want to go there, just know that God is not mocked, okay? Real freedom is from being a slave to those sins, and you are forgiven. And that gives you the ability to breathe and feel fresh and to make the right decisions in life. But some people go to that other end, and they try to be perfect in every way, not even so much in God's eyes, but in people's eyes. Those are the people who fall back into slavery. even after accepting Christ, because they forgot that it was the freedom that truly rules. And so I just felt the need to say that. There are rules in Christ, but they are for our good, to set us free from our slavery to those things that are bad. And also to set us free from our determination to appear perfect to everyone else. Father God, we come here today, and I just hope, Lord, that someone hears this message. I do not like talking about some of these tendencies, and I kind of hesitate to do so, but Lord, I also know that there are probably other people out there who have experienced similar things, and that I'm not nearly as unique as I think I am. I know, Lord, that there are people who struggle and who try to appear perfect to everyone else and don't appear genuine and real. There are people who become just nervous little anxious knots because they want to do everything exactly right and anything less is a failure. God, I pray for the people here today that they will see that the freedom of Christ proclaimed to the Galatians is the very freedom that we can receive today. And it may not be from Old Testament rituals. I mean, it is, but in a way that more relates to us. It's freedom also from that perfectionism that drives us into the ground and exhausts us. And Lord, if there are others here today who want to take advantage of that freedom, Lord, let us just know that that path ends up in slavery too. Not the same kind, but certainly a kind of slavery. So instead, let us find somewhere in between the ability to accept your grace and to lead us into a relationship that changes us from the inside out, so that as we go through that, we obey those laws and rules more and more, becoming better people, but doing so in the context of a relationship with you. So God, today, if there's anything we can do, we run to an actual relationship with you. We redirect our energies from appearing perfect or being perfect to pursuing you. And we will let you then do the perfecting in your good time and in your will. And we'll find ourselves one day standing in your presence, declared holy by a holy God. And that is the only time that anyone's opinion will matter at all. In the name of your Son we pray. Amen.